e4, c6, d4, d5.
The Caro Kann defense is a favorite weapon of players with a positional style. For example, it features in Karpov's repertoire, who aim for a solid position with a large number of pieces in a flexible pawn formation, in order at the first opportunity to take the initiative. In the variations examined below, black attacks the center with c6-c5, thereby losing a tempo. But in contrast to the French defense, his light square bishop can be freely developed, and this compensates to a considerable extent for the lost tempo.
e5.
This constricting variation leads to sharp play with attacking chances for white.
e6
Is poor, leading to positions examined in the French defense with an extra tempo for white. After
knight f3, c5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, bishop d3.
Followed by Rocade Pendek and Menteri e2, he has a clear advantage. After
c5, c3, d takes c5, e6, bishop e3, knight e7, c3, knight d7, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, bishop takes c5, bishop takes c5, knight takes c5, short castle, queen b6, a4, short castle.
Is more accurate, but here too white's chances are preferable. Kovchan Korniev, Serpikov 2003.
Knight f5, bishop d4, queen c7, bishop d3, bishop takes c5, bishop takes c5, queen takes c5, bishop takes f5, e takes f5, knight f3, knight c6, short castle, knight b d2.
Boleslavsky.
Knight c6.
Relatively equal play comes after
Bishop f4, e6, knight d2, knight g e7, knight g f3, knight g6, bishop g3, bishop takes c5, knight b3, bishop b6, bishop d3, short castle, bishop takes g6, f takes g6, queen d2, bishop d7, h4, rook f5, long castle, a5.
Leads to a roughly equal game. Bologan L. Hansen, Debrecen 1992.
Bishop b5, queen a5, check, knight c3, e6.
Is weaker in view of
Bishop e3, knight g e7, knight f3, knight f5, a3, knight takes e3, f takes e3, queen c7, e4, d takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes c5, knight takes c5, queen a5, check, b4, queen takes b5, queen d6.
Shabalov K. Arkell, London 1991.
e6. Bishop e3.
Is an alternative, after.
Knight g e7. c3. Bishop d7. Bishop takes c6. Knight takes c6. f4. g5.
A fashionable reaction, aimed at challenging White's center.
F takes g5. Bishop g7. Knight f3. Queen c7. Bishop d4. Knight takes e5. Knight takes e5. Bishop takes e5. Knight d2.
White has the advantage, Zezulkan Chidilek, Poland 2002.
b4.
After.
Queen h4. c3. Queen e4. Check. Knight e2. Queen takes g2. Knight g3. Queen h3. Bishop g5. f5. f3.
Black is in difficulties, Manazy and Kenkin, Minsk 1990.
a5.
Interesting is.
Bishop takes c6. Check. B takes c6. c3. A takes b4. C takes b4. Queen h4. Bishop d2. Queen e4. Check. Queen e2. Queen takes g2. Queen f3. Queen takes f3. Knight takes f3.
With the better ending.
c3. A takes b4. C takes b4. Queen h4. Queen b3. Queen e4. Check. Knight e2. Queen takes e5. Bishop b2. Queen c7. Short castle. Knight f6.
According to analysis by Kenkin, the chances are equal.
Bishop f5. Knight c3.
The idea of this move is that after the natural reply 4, e6 White plays 5, g4, and the bishop can no longer go to either e4 or d7.
h6. g4. Bishop h7. e6. F takes e6. Knight f3. Knight f6. Bishop d3. Knight e4. Queen e2. Knight d7. Knight takes e4. D takes e4. Bishop takes e4. Bishop takes e4. Queen takes e4. Queen a5. Check. Bishop d2. Queen d5. Queen g6. Check.
Nunn Bellin, Thessaloniki 1984.
a6. Bishop e3. Queen c7.
Timon Spielman, Reykjavik 1991.
Bishop d3. Bishop takes d3. Queen takes d3. e6. Rook c1.
Spielman.
h5. Bishop d3. Bishop takes d3. Queen takes d3. e6. Knight f3,
if,
knight h6, short castle, knight f5, knight e2, knight d7,
then,
knight g3, knight h4, knight takes h4, queen takes h4, bishop e3, queen d8, rook f d1,
Nundalugi, London 1986.
queen b6, short castle,
Also possible is,
knight d7,
or,
knight e7,
aiming for development, is perhaps more accurate.
queen a6, queen d1, knight e7, knight e2, knight d7, c3, knight f5, bishop g5, bishop e7, knight g3,
With a slight advantage to white, short Sarawon, Rotterdam 1989.
queen b6,
Another interesting option is,
h4, h5, bishop e2, e6, knight f3, bishop e7, rook b1, bishop g4, knight g5, bishop takes e2, knight takes e2, c5, d takes c5, queen takes c5, short castle,
S. Priamasisvam v. Razvati, Silav Luti C., 1994.
bishop d3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, e6, knight g e2, queen a6, queen h3, knight e7, short castle, knight d7, a4, queen a5, bishop e3,
With advantage S. Hansen Lalib, Moscow 1994. Thus the freeing attempt
c5,
can be met by the interesting
d takes c5, knight takes c5, b4,
This same idea is also effective after 12. Kuda Pukul E5.
queen takes b4, knight b5,
When the seemingly harmless move of the rook's pawn 10a4 supports this important knight advance, a standard procedure which is worth remembering.
e6,
Apart from this continuation, which is nevertheless the main line, black has also played. An alternative is provided by
h4, h5, knight c e2,
after
queen b6, knight g3,
white has strong pressure on the h5 pawn.
c5, bishop e3, queen b6, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, bishop takes c5, queen takes c5, knight d4, knight e7, bishop b5, check, knight b c6, knight g e2, short castle, bishop takes c6, knight takes c6, knight takes c6, b takes c6, c3, f6, b4, queen b6, queen d4, queen c7,
Kaprikik Antonio, Moscow 1994. Or,
bishop e3, knight d7,
comes into consideration.
knight e7, g4, bishop g6, bishop g2, h5, h3, c5, d takes c5, h takes g4, h takes g4, rook takes h1, bishop takes h1, knight e c6, queen e2,
With the better prospects, Nibor Spielman, London 1992.
g4, bishop g6, knight g e2,
White consistently puts into effect his plan of playing against the opponent's light square bishop. Now black has three main replies: 6, f6, 6. Gaja e7 and 6, c5. Other possibilities:
bishop b4, h4, bishop e4, rook h3, h5, knight g3, c5, bishop g5, queen b6, bishop d2,
Vasyukov Razuvayev, Vilnius 1980/1.
h6, bishop e3, bishop takes c3, check, b takes c3, queen a5, queen d2, queen a4, rook c1, bishop e4, rook h3, knight d7, c4,
And White began active play. Zibert Eperjesi, Budapest 1995.
knight e7,
White has also tried.
f4,
If,
h5,
then,
f5, e takes f5, g5,
with compensation for the material.
c5, h4, h5, f5, e takes f5, g5, knight e c6, bishop g2, c takes d4, knight takes d5, knight d7, knight takes d4, knight d takes e5, knight b5, rook c8, queen e2, bishop d6, knight takes d6, check, queen takes d6, bishop f4, short castle, long castle, queen c5, rook h3,
And White has more than sufficient compensation for the pawn. Topalov Beriv, Dordman 2002.
knight g3, c takes d4, knight b5, knight e c6, f5, bishop c5, knight d6, check, bishop takes d6, e takes d6, queen takes d6, bishop g2, f6, f takes g6, h takes g6. Short castle. Knight d7. Rook f2. Long castle. c3.
And in this complicated position white is slightly better. Anand Karpov, Vakon Z2003.
Bishop e3. h5. Knight f4. H takes g4. Knight takes g6. Knight takes g6. Bishop d3. Knight takes e5. D takes e5. d4. Bishop g6.
With compensation for the material. Kuzo Engvist, Sweden 1994.
Queen takes g4. Knight h4. Bishop d3. g6. Long castle. Bishop e7. King b1. Knight d7. Knight e2. Knight b6. Knight f4.
Nun Karpov, Monaco 1994. White has harmoniously deployed his forces and controls more space. Black is obliged to defend passively, relying on his strong point at f5. White has a clear initiative.
Queen h4. Bishop e3. Knight h6.
Taking the pawn is dangerous, since the black queen ends up in a dangerous position from which it is difficult to escape without loss of material.
Bishop takes h6. G takes h6. Knight g3. Bishop e7. f4. f6. Bishop g2.
Blumenfeld-Kasparian, USSR 1931.
e4. c6. d4. d5. e5. Bishop f5. Knight c3. e6. g4. Bishop g6. Knight g e2. f6. Knight f4.
The attempt to preserve the bishop from exchange by
Bishop f7.
is hardly good on account of
E takes f6. G takes f6. Queen e2. Queen e7. Knight d3. Knight d7. f4. Bishop g7. Bishop e3. e5. F takes e5. F takes e5. Knight takes e5. Knight takes e5. D takes e5. Queen takes e5. Long castle. Knight f6. g5. Knight e4.
leads only to equality. Sveshnikov Weizmanavin, Helsinki 1992.
Queen e2. F takes e5. Queen takes e5. Knight d7. Queen e2. Queen f6. Queen e7. Knight d3. Bishop g6. h4.
With advantage, Timon Anand, Amsterdam 1992.
F takes e5.
An alternative to the main line may be provided by
Knight takes g6.
which occurred in Balashov-Belin, Karlovac 1979. After
H takes g6. D takes e5. Bishop c5. Bishop f4.
White, After supporting the key point of his position, the e5 pawn retained the initiative. Definite compensation for the sacrificed material is promised by
d takes e5, bishop f7, queen e2,
after
knight d7, bishop h3, d4, knight e4, knight c5, bishop d2, g5, knight h5, bishop takes h5, g takes h5, queen d5, bishop g2.
Black encountered difficulties. Korzubov Efimov, USSR 1980.
c5, knight c takes d5, e takes d5, e6, bishop g6, knight takes g6, h takes g6, queen f3.
Fabri Carpetti, Cor, 1983.
Knight takes e6, queen e7, knight takes f8, e takes d4, check, bishop e2, queen takes f8.
Preserving the bishop requires testing.
d takes c3, knight takes g6,
After
c takes b2, bishop takes b2, h takes g6, queen d4.
White has excellent play for the pawn.
h takes g6, queen d3, knight f6,
Nunn Anderson, London 1982, continued.
queen takes g6, check,
Can also be considered. After
king f8, king d8, b takes c3, knight b d7, queen g5, knight c5, queen e3, knight c e4, g5, knight d7, bishop b2, knight takes g5, queen takes e7, check, king takes e7, c4.
the endgame favors white thanks to his strong pair of bishops, Kobylyevsky. Street, Petersburg 2001.
Queen takes c3, knight b d7, bishop e3, knight e4, queen d4,
With chances for both sides.
e4, c6, d4, d5, e5, bishop f5, knight c3, e6, g4, bishop g6, knight g e2, bishop e7, bishop e3, knight d7.
White prepares queenside castling. The plan with kingside castling, which occurred in the game Sakis-Rogers, Calcutta 1988, allowed black to seize the initiative.
Bishop g2, queen b6, rook b1, h5, knight f4, h takes g4, knight takes g6, f takes g6, queen takes g4, knight f8, short castle, rook h4, queen d2,
White sets up a long castling. After.
b5, bishop g2, h5, knight f4, h takes g4, knight takes g6, f takes g6, h3, queen a5, knight e2, queen takes d2, check, king takes d2.
White has a clear advantage. Jorth Haque, Dubai 1986. In the event of
Queen a5, knight f4, bishop b4, h4, long castle,
the complications favor White.
h5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, d4, bishop takes d4, c5, h takes g6, c takes d4, long castle, knight h6, queen e2,
Becerra Riccardi, San Martin 1995.
h5, knight f4,
It would be interesting to try.
knight f8, h takes g4, knight takes g6, f takes g6, bishop d3, knight f8, long castle,
Is also possible. After.
h3, knight f8, long castle, queen a5, a3, b5, knight a2, queen takes d2, check, king takes d2,
The chances are equal. Kamsky Miles, New York 1989.
knight e2, knight f8, long castle,
The game Natif G. Anderson, Stockholm 2003 continued.
knight h6, h3, rook h4, knight f4, queen d7, bishop d3,
With an obvious advantage to White.
e4, c6, d4, d5, e5, bishop f5, knight c3, e6, g4, bishop g6, knight g e2, c5.
The most popular continuation. Black immediately attacks the base of the White pawn chain. The alternative is to strengthen White's presence in the center by
Bishop e3,
after.
knight c6, d takes c5, rook c8, h5, knight d4, h takes g4, bishop b5,
With initiative.
a6, g5, knight takes e5, f4, knight g4, bishop g1, knight g e7, knight a4,
White has a very slight advantage, Svidler Masieha, Bermuda 2003.
H4. Knight C6. H5.
Or.
Bishop E4. Knight takes E4. D takes E4. C3. C takes D4. Knight takes D4. Knight takes D4. C takes D4. Bishop B4. Check. Bishop D2. Bishop takes C2. Queen takes C2. C takes D4. Knight B1. Rook C8. Queen A4. Queen B6. Knight F4.
With a slight advantage, Kotronias Jurek, Corfu 1993.
F6.
Or.
H5. Bishop F7. E takes F6.
None.
Knight F4. Bishop F7. E takes F6.
Weaker is.
G takes F6. Queen E2.
Or.
Knight takes F6. G5. C takes D4. Queen takes D4. G takes F6. Queen A4. Check. Knight C6. Bishop E3. Bishop D6. Long castle. Knight G E7. G5. F5.
With chances for both sides, none. Kokotsa, Thessaloniki 1984.
H5. Knight F4.
After.
Bishop H7. Knight takes H5. C takes D4. Queen takes D4. Knight C6. Bishop B5. Knight G E7. Bishop H6.
White gains the advantage, Van der Wiel Eiklickie, Brussels 1987.
Knight C6. Knight takes G6. F takes G6. Knight E2. H takes G4. Knight F4. Knight takes D4. Queen takes G4.
With the initiative. Or.
C takes D4. Knight takes D4. King D7. Bishop E3. Knight G E7. Knight B3.
With advantage to white, Shirov.
Knight G E7. Knight F4. C takes D4. Bishop H3. Knight takes E5. Queen E2. Knight 7 C6. Knight takes E6. Queen A5. Check. King F1.
And white has definite compensation for the pawn. Timon Karpov, Jakarta 1993.
c takes d4, knight takes d4, h5.
Also possible is
Bishop b5, check, knight d7, f4.
transposes.
f4, h takes g4, bishop b5, check, knight d7, f5. Bishop takes f5, knight takes f5, e takes f5, queen takes d5, queen c7,
Loses to
bishop f4,
Sacrificial, Hungary 1985.
rook takes h4,
Or
rook g1, bishop h5, f takes e6, f takes e6, knight takes e6, queen b6.
with very sharp play, Van der Wiel Spielman, Vake on Z 1983.
Rook f1, rook h2,
Loses quickly to
bishop takes d7, check, king takes d7, queen takes g4, e takes f5, knight takes f5, bishop takes f5, queen takes f5, check, king c6, bishop g5.
More Mills, USA 1984. But Sirawan's recommendation of
Rook h5,
should be considered.
e takes f5, queen e2, bishop f4, a6, e6, a takes b5, queen e2, bishop e7,
Western in Adianto, Thessaloniki 1988, and hereafter.
knight takes d5, knight c5, knight c7, check, king f8, long castle,
White's initiative is very dangerous.
h6,
Black's other possibilities are
h5, bishop h7, bishop e3, queen b6, queen d2, knight c6, long castle, c4,
is also possible.
knight c6, d takes c5, knight takes e5, knight d4, knight f6, bishop b5, check, knight f d7,
Udis and Sarawan, Jacksonville 1990.
f4, bishop e7, bishop g2, bishop takes h4, check, king f1, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight c6, f5,
Vlasov Guliv, Russia 1994.
knight takes e5, bishop f4, bishop f6, bishop e3.
Other attempts for an advantage lead to double-edged play.
knight c6, d takes c5, knight takes e5, knight f4, a6, bishop g2, knight f6, queen e2.
Timon Karpov, Belfort 1988.
C takes d4, knight takes d4, h5, f4, h takes g4,
Is dangerous on account of
f5, rook takes h4, bishop b5, check, knight d7, rook f1, bishop takes f5, knight takes f5, rook h5, knight g3, queen h4, knight c e2, rook takes e5, queen d3.
with a growing initiative for white, Brink Clausen Hove, Tostrup 1995.
Bishop b4, h5,
White also has the better prospects after
bishop h7, queen d2, knight d7, a3, bishop a5, b4, bishop b6, f4,
Kotronia Spielman, New York 1990.
bishop e4, f3, bishop h7, bishop d3,
The exchange
bishop takes c3, check,
merely strengthens the opponent's center after
b takes c3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, knight d7, long castle, bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, rook c8, queen e1, knight takes e5, bishop f4,
with an unpleasant initiative for the pawn Timon Sarawan, Tilburg 1990.
queen b6,
Other moves are less sound. With accurate play, black can quite easily neutralize the immediate.
queen d2,
The capture on b2 looks dubious, since after
queen takes b2, rook b1, queen takes c2, queen takes c2, bishop takes c2, rook takes b7, c4, knight b5.
the activity of white's pieces more than compensates for the pawn.
Knight c6, long castle,
If,
knight b4,
then,
knight f4, bishop takes c2, bishop b5, check, king d8, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, knight f takes d5, h5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, bishop takes c5, queen takes c5, knight f4, knight g e7.
with equality A. Sokolov-Karpov, Linners Match 1987.
f4,
With the text move, white consistently pursues his opening course of a pawn attack against the opponent's kingside.
knight c6, f5, bishop h7, queen d2, long castle, long castle.
After.
C takes d4, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, queen a5, king b1.
White has a clear advantage. He controls more space and his pieces are better placed. The attempt to win material by 15, e pukul f5 16, g pukul f5 gaja pukul f5 does not bring any relief after 17. Kuda b5, with the text move black tries to gain space on the queenside, prevent his opponent from occupying the important d4 square, and take control of d3, which ensures the activity of his bishop waiting in ambush at h7.
c4, knight f4, queen a6, f takes e6,
Now after.
b5, e takes f7, knight g e7, knight e6.
White has the advantage. Timon Sarawan, Hilversum 1990. If.
Knight b4, e takes f7,
After.
knight takes a2, check, knight takes a2, queen takes a2,
The simple.
queen c3,
Followed by the exchange of queens retains a big advantage for white.
knight e7,
Instead the immediate.
g5,
Is possible, and after.
bishop takes c2, bishop h3, check, king b8, rook d g1.
White has the advantage, thanks to the opponent's misplaced light square bishop.
a3, knight takes c2.
Both sides have chances. Prasad Ravi, India 1991. In the game white blundered with. Whereas.
Queen f2, knight a1, rook e1, knight b3, check, king d1, b5.
Would have maintained the tension.
g5,
When.
knight a1,
Forced his resignation.
f takes e6,